So, is there any chance that I could talk you into moving a little closer to the front? I mean, I'm not going to force the issue, but there is space in this row right here, and this way you'll get first chance to ask questions. No. Okay, let's get started. I wasn't here 2 weeks ago for the first session, but if you were here, you got an overview of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's life, and you talked a little bit about turning points in his career, in his life, how it is that he came to be this movement, this dynamic trajectory in his life from a promising young theologian in his early 20s. We might even call him ordinary, because he had no sense of himself as playing an important role in the movement of history. He was just wanted to be a pastor, and a good pastor, and he was a theologian. So he moved from that to a leader. In his late 20s and early 30s, he was a leader in the Confessing Church of Germany, which if you followed that history, the official Lutheran Church of Germany kind of bought into the Nazi ideology, and the people the Lutherans that thought this was the wrong direction to go, kind of broke away and started a different church denomination, which was really tough, as you can imagine, for many reasons. And Bonhoeffer became a leader in that organization during his late 20s and early 30s. And then as the war broke out, he moved one step further and became an active member of the German resistance against Hitler. And that eventually led to his imprisonment and his execution. So Bonhoeffer became one of my personal heroes. When I was in seminary, I had to read 2 books by Bonhoeffer. The Cost of Discipleship, as it's the English title of it. I loaned that one away, so I don't have it anymore. But I still have my copy of Life Together, and those two, Cost of Discipleship and Life Together, form a big part of the basis of the lesson for today. In addition, in our travels in Germany, Deb and I have been able to visit a couple Bonhoeffer sites or locations that were important in his life. Among them, the little town of Zingst in northern Germany that Bonhoeffer selected as the site for his unauthorized seminary. When the Confessing Church started, they had no way of training pastors because the official universities and seminaries were all under the control of the state church, which was under the control of the Nazi movement. And so he started this little seminary in the town of Zingst, but unfortunately, Zingst was a seaside resort that was popular with some of the families of the leaders of the Nazi party, and so it became too highly visible. It was drawing too much attention, so he had to move this to a more obscure site, but the Gestapo found it anyway and closed it down a few years later. We also were able to visit the concentration camp at Flossenburg, which is the location where Bonhoeffer was executed by hanging in this courtyard on the morning of April 9, 1945, only a month before the end of the war. What a tragedy that was, that he didn't make it through to the ending of the war. Okay, so what we're going to talk about today are some key themes in the life and work of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And you'll become familiar with this particular chart because it shows up again and again over this lesson. These 4 themes: the idea of the other, or the neighbor, the idea of community, the idea of grace, and the idea of individual responsibility before God and responsibility towards community. Now, next week, when Eric leads you through the lesson, going to be adding a 5th theme right in the middle, which is Christ, because all of these themes are directly tied to the Christ-centered nature of Bonhoeffer's theology. Everything leads back to Christ in the center. Okay, so I'm going to read you part of this as we go through this. Let's start with the other or neighbor. Now, if you only leave with those four terms, other, neighbor, community, grace, and responsibility, you will already have a great foundation for understanding Bonhoeffer's work and his theology, his writings. But we're going to try to unpack them a little bit. And you might notice that the image in the center is a circle, and it's a circle with arrows in a particular direction. And that's put there on purpose to try to indicate the dynamic flow of his thinking and the fact that it was circular, in that as he moved through the different phases of his career, his thinking developed along these lines, and then he kept revisiting those themes again and again in his work. So you get the idea of the circle, the cycle, and the repetitiveness. At each time he went back to these ideas in his life, there was a deeper layer because of his life experience in the context of what was happening with Germany in the 1930s and then into the Second World War. Okay, so when we think about the other, we have to start with the idea that it's tied to community. So these two things, other and community, were part of his early thinking right after he finished his theological training. So he got his PhD when he was only in his early 20s. In the year 1927, and he published his doctoral dissertation, and it contained those two themes, other and community. Then the grace theme comes out more when he was in his late 20s and early 30s as a leader in the confessing church, and that's when he wrote the book Discipleship, or Cost of Discipleship. And then this idea of responsibility before God and to other people is what came into his theology primarily as a result of the Second World War and his idea about taking action, that there's something that compels Christians not just to know and to understand and to love, but to also act as well. Now, some theologians have argued that in this doctoral dissertation that he wrote in 1927, that he developed a new theology of sociology. Not sociology, sociality. Okay, now that's kind of, it doesn't translate well from German. But anyway, basically, what we learn here is his focus on the other, the neighbor. And the difference between the contemporary theologians and philosophers that were working in German at that time and that were influencing him as his professors and the people that he came into contact. Bonhoeffer believed that to be human means to come into contact, to encounter the other, the neighbor. And most of the philosophers that were writing at the time were thinking of the other in opposition. Why do we study the other? To learn something about ourselves. And the other represents the them against us, the unknown against the known, and all that sort of stuff. And with the racial ideology that was bubbling up through the Nazi Party, it was pretty clear who the other was. Anybody who wasn't Aryan and fit in with the Nazi framework. Anyway, and so against that kind of idea, Bonhoeffer developed this sociality idea that emphasized the importance and the integrity of the other as other, that we need to respect these people as people for their own sake, for their own right, and what we can learn about them and not just what we can learn about ourselves by studying them. And so, what this makes me think of is the word alien as it's being used in the United States over the past 20 years. We're not so much talking about people coming from other planets or other universes. We're talking about people that are different from us, right, that are alien. And the term alien, including the movie, where we did have an extraterrestrial life form that was attacking people. It's a kind of a scary concept. It's a threatening concept. And against that, Bonhoeffer wants to say, the other is a neighbor, not the other. It's not an alien that's threatening, but it's positive and affirming that the other is worthwhile knowing and getting to know in his or her own right. Okay, at about that same time, he was thinking about and writing about community. So these two things go together. The concept of the neighbor existing outside your community and the concept of your community, the communion of saints, the people in your worshiping community, the people in your own circle of friends and so on, these are tightly related. These belong together, right? We can't say them against us, the outsiders and our insiders in our community. This is all part and parcel of God's work in the world, and that we're part of it. So this is where the book Life Together comes in, because in that he hits really hard the idea of Christ existing in community, in relationship, people to people, people to Christ. This is, when we think about the disciples trudging along the road, listening to Jesus tell stories, work miracles, probably got depressed and tired and angry and so on. This was life together on the road through Galilee and towards Jerusalem. And Dietrich Bonhoeffer was living this out in this little seminary, surrounded by the students and the faculty that he had recruited to this, knowing that it really was an us against them kind of thing, where they were constantly under threat of being discovered, being arrested, being jailed, maybe even being killed. And yet that community lived life daily together, over and over, going through the rituals. And later in his life, he got kind of fed up with rituals in religion. But at this point, he was still thinking about the daily rituals of prayer, of communion, of talking together, of eating, sharing over a meal, that these are things that were important for community. Now, grace, as we think about that word grace associated with Lutherans, right? Justified by grace. It was percolating through Bonhoeffer's mind all the way through his university and seminary education as he was training to be a pastor. And a lot of the focus was on opposition between Lutherans and the Roman Catholics and other people that were saying we need to do certain things to become right with God. Against that, Bonhoeffer's arguing that let's set aside the idea that any of our works gets us right with God. That's Lutheran theology. We know where we stand on that. But the next step is, now that we're free from judgment from God, are we done? And Bonhoeffer says no. That's where the idea of cheap grace versus costly grace comes in. And in his Cost of Discipleship, he argues that it's costly grace that makes the difference in people's lives. That costly grace gives us freedom from judgment by God, but it's freedom not just from something, but it's freedom for something. And that for something is freedom for others. So you can already see how all these themes are tying together. The other, the community, and even grace, justification by grace, are all tied together in terms of being free to live out our lives in community and for other people. Now that's where discipleship comes in. So I'm going to read you a little quote from Bonhoeffer here. Cheap grace is the preaching of forgiveness without repentance. It is baptism without the discipline of community. Cheap grace is grace without discipleship, grace without the cross, grace without the living incarnate Jesus Christ. And so Bonhoeffer goes on to say, costly grace causes a disciple to leave one's nets and follow Jesus. Costly grace did not excuse one from works, which is, what the argument had been about. If you're justified by grace, you don't need to do anything more. Bonhoeffer says, no, you're free to do these things, not because they're earning you points with God, but because that's your response to what God has done for you. Okay, so if you put those three themes together, other, neighbor, community, and grace, then it leads directly to his fourth theme, which is responsibility that Christians have towards other people, towards society, towards the world. And so here he introduces the term that he had first used back in 1927. Now we're talking about 1942. He goes back to it. This vicarious representative action. Well, of course, vicarious action here, we're talking about Christ. Christ died for us. And so our forgiveness comes through our joining with Christ and being covered with Christ's blood. So you're familiar with what vicarious means, right? It means in place of. So to experience something by tying into the experience of somebody else. You're vicariously experiencing pain or joy or something because somebody else is. And so he's saying that just as Christ did that for us, now it's our turn, that it's the responsibility of Christians to live out this kind of representative action towards the other people who need it, the other people who are in our community and those that are still being excluded from our community. Okay, now, and this is probably the most philosophical concept in the entire lesson, and that is ethics as formation. What does that mean? That instead of philosophical ethics that are looking for what is the right thing to do in any given situation, philosophers were looking for what is good? What is the good thing to do? What is the right thing to do? What would always be good? What would always be right? Bonhoeffer comes down on the other side of that and saying that ethics is not a list of rules about what you should do and what you shouldn't do. Ethics is the lived church in the world. That it is the formation of the church that brings about the rightness or wrongness of the action in the world. I told you it's tough. It's a difficult concept, but it's that we are formed as people by being part of the church's work in the world as it is forming the appropriate response to the needs of the world at that time and place. Now, after the war was over, a lot of people criticized Bonhoeffer because they called his approach situational ethics, right? What was right to do in 1942 might have been wrong to do in 1932 or 1952, right? What was right to do in that context of Nazi Germany might have been wrong to do in Canada at some other point in time. Okay? Now, if you're a firm believer in this philosophical point of view of ethics that says there are things that are absolutely right and absolutely wrong at any time, any place, or whatever, this is a problem, right? But Bonhoeffer became convinced that this was a kairos moment for the German church, that it had the German Christians had never experienced anything exactly like this before, and that they couldn't go back to the rule books, the things that theologians in the 1500s had written and say, well, this is what we should do, because it was a new situation. It had to, the rightness or wrongness of the event had to be experienced in the formation of the church in community. Boy, if you got that, that's pretty impressive. Okay, moving on here. I want to read you something about one other thing I missed was that this ethics as formation is a concrete ethic as opposed to an abstract ethic. That is, it's buried in, it's embedded in the lived experience right here, right now. And so in a way we can think of Bonhoeffer as a practical theologian. He wasn't so interested in all the flowery doctrines of the church. He was interested in how do people live their daily lives. especially when they're under pressure of the kind of pressure that none of us have ever experienced. Living in Nazi Germany as anybody that opposed Hitler, in 1942 would have been extremely difficult. Okay, that's it. Okay, moving on now. Given this, it's no surprise that when Bonhoeffer had been arrested and he was writing a letter to support other people, other Christians who had been arrested, that he developed a view called the view from below. If you think about the complexity of the issues that the German population was facing at that particular point in time, when we're in a tough situation, in a nitty-gritty situation, most people think the appropriate thing is to zoom out and get kind of a bird's eye view of the situation, kind of the broader perspective, and that makes sense in a lot of situations. But Bonhoeffer disagreed. He said, "It remains an experience of incomparable value that we have for once learned to see the great events of world history from below." What does he mean by that? From the perspective of the outcasts, the suspects, the maltreated, the powerless, the oppressed and reviled. In short, from the perspective of the suffering. Now you have to remember that Bonhoeffer had lived a pretty privileged life for the first 25, 30 years. His family was prosperous. He had a good education. He was smart and talented. He got respect wherever he went. He went to the United States. He went to England. People really liked him, and they appreciated what he had to do. And kind of doors were open to him. Leadership roles. He had a lot of freedom. And then in 1943, he's arrested. Okay? And he spent almost 2 years imprisoned in a variety of Nazi prisons before being executed. And who else was in those prisons? It wasn't the cream of the crop. It was the undesirables from the Nazi point of view. It was people that they didn't want around, and some of them they killed, others they kept in prison and hoped that they would die on their own. I think Bonhoeffer was too well known for them to execute him at the beginning. They wanted to, but that they knew that this would bring an international outcry because of the respect that people in other countries had for Bonhoeffer. So they kept him alive. They interrogated him many times, but from what I've read, I don't believe that he was tortured. I think that he was treated with respect, and they gave him paper and pens, and he continued to write books many letters while he was in prison. The other people didn't have those privileges, but he was surrounded by people who were the suffering, the persecuted. Many of them were on their way to being executed. And he began to take their perspective and, circling around, began to be able to see even those people are my neighbor. Right? Even those people I have this responsibility for. Not just the members of my church, not just the people who believe as I do, but even these other people, because they're suffering, because they're oppressed and reviled. Okay, now, I've already alluded to this, but this last slide in this sequence is intended to show you the historical development of his ideas, that back in 1927 in his doctoral dissertation, he had picked up the theme of other and neighbor and the theme of community. And then in his writings in the early 30s, he picks up the idea of discipleship and the costly grace versus cheap grace, and freedom not from things, but freedom for things. And then the idea of responsibility in community comes in, and forming your ethics as a result of the concrete lived reality of your situation comes in during the war, and then cycles back to this view from below. Okay, last slide here is the kind of the core question, and this is going to be leading into next week's lesson. In one of his last letters, he wrote to a friend, "What keeps gnawing at me is the question, what is Christianity? Or who is Christ actually for us today?" And he's not giving us the catechism here, he's not giving us the Apostles' Creed, but he's saying Christ exists for the world, for us. And we Christians exist, our purpose is to be for the world, not for ourselves. And so, once again, after the war, after he died, some theologians criticized him for not balancing the hope of heaven and the life eternal against the hope of a better life here on earth. I believe that Bonhoeffer believed in both of those, but he was saying in this situation, in the 1940s, in the midst of this, people are dying like flies all around. The hope of heaven is not the key thing that the church needs to be emphasizing. The church needs to be emphasizing how are Christians meant to live today. That was his perspective. You don't need to agree with it. And as you're probably going to react negatively to the translation of one of his German phrases called religionless Christianity. How can you have Christianity without religion? Well, if think back to when he was working on Community, he was talking about the daily rituals of Christian life and the rituals of worship, that we do things in a certain way, that at the church at that time, people wore certain clothing to do certain things, and they used certain utensils, and there was a lot of ritual, even in the Lutheran Church, not just the Roman Catholic Church. A lot of ritual. And this ritual is meaningful for a lot of people. But he was saying, in that context, let's work for a religion-less Christianity, kind of a bare-bones Christianity, kind of a Christianity that strips away all the things that are nice. If you've got money and time and health, what is it that you need when you don't have those things? What part of Christianity, what is Christ for us today in that setting where we have nothing, where we might die at any moment, where we see suffering all around us? Do we really need all the rituals of the church at that point? And he's saying, no. Okay, we're not in that situation. But in order to understand Bonhoeffer's writings, you have to realize the context in which he was writing and his lived experience from at least 1933 on. He was under constant threat of being arrested and killed for his views opposing Hitler. Okay. I think that's everything that they wanted me to cover in relation to these slides, so let's move to the discussion now. Okay. Oh, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Bonhoeffer.
Concepts and understanding of what does it mean to be Christian. Well, it's kind of how he changed over time. How he changed over time, right? In that he, his lived experience affected the way that he understood what it meant to be Christian. Which is pretty cool. And it was different because he wasn't, I loved what you said about him being a practical theologian, because I don't know if this was your experience in seminary, but when I was in seminary, I remember remember taking so many classes about just like theology, right? And going, well, okay, yeah, but how do I do this like here? How do I do this? I can't give this big dissertation when somebody comes to me with issues. I want to know how to do that. And I think that was kind of what Bonhoeffer was learning was how do you do the bare bones? How do you do Jesus in the midst of what he and so many others were experiencing? So you have a handout that kind of summarizes it for you. It should say 8 ethical and theological claims about the neighbor in the words of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. I don't know that I'm ever going to pronounce it correctly. And really, it's just, I'm curious about your thoughts of each of these stages. Does that sound like something that would, do you resonate with it or not? So the first thing is the Christian loves the real neighbor. And this idea, the quote here, I don't know if you have it written down. Okay, yes, you have exactly right. Okay. So the quote here is, this being for each other must now be actualized through acts of love. 3 great positive possibilities of acting for each other in the community of saints present themselves. Self-renouncing active work for the neighbor, intercessory prayer, and finally the mutual forgiveness of sins in God's name. All of these involve giving up the self for my neighbor's benefit, with the readiness to do and bear everything in the neighbor's place. Indeed, if necessary, to sacrifice myself, standing as a substitute for my neighbor, even if purely vicarious action is rarely actualized. It is intended in every genuine act of love. So, he's saying, in your intention, every time that we care for our neighbor, to have a sense of being willing to sacrifice yourself, which I find a little daunting. Yes?
I don't know if Deb's willing to tell the story, but there's a story about the island of Rhodes, one of the small islands off of Rhodes, where the Jews were being rounded up and sent to a concentration camp. Can you tell the rest of that story?
Well, the Italian government had already stopped fighting, right? And so the Nazis went around all of a sudden decided to round up all the Jews on all the islands from Greece. And it was at near the end of the war. It was the last, 18 months or something. And so they sent Nazi soldiers to each island and went underground to find out where the Jews were and gathered them up, and their neighbors gave them away. And off they went. And they went to several islands. They got to this small island. I do not remember the name of it. And there were only 2 people on the dock when the Nazis got there. And they said, "Where are all the Jews?" And these 2 people were the mayor and the minister, the priest from the Greek Orthodox Church. And they said, "We are the only Jews on the island." And they went, and the other Jews were sent.
Wow.
That's vicarious sacrifice for you.
That is. Wow. For those who might be watching, Deb was relaying from your travels around. Okay. Well.
We have been to Rhodes, but we didn't see it.
Okay, but you didn't see that island. So that near the end of the war, when, I'm guessing they were rounding everybody up because they knew that they were done for and they wanted to I don't know.
Kill as many people as they could.
Right. So the Nazis began to round up everybody, all the Jews on these islands around Greece. And neighbors and everything were giving them up. But then they got to this last small island, and there was just the mayor and the Orthodox priest. And when they said, "Where are all the Jews?" those two men said, "We are the only Jews on this island," and went in the place of everybody who had been hiding, which is, that's amazing. And that's why I think I find that concept daunting, because like, how many of us would, right? So I think in some way, I mean, a lot of ways this is aspirational, right? Hopefully we will never be in a situation where that is a choice. But if we're open enough and vulnerable enough in community with our neighbor to be willing, that's what Bonhoeffer is talking about. You know, and we talk about it too when we talk about the body of Christ in the world. That's part of it. And Tom, when you were going over earlier about grace and his idea that you were freed, you were freed by grace, and you were freed to help and love and serve your neighbor. That is directly from Luther. That is from Luther's Freedom of a Christian. So, but this was revolutionary at that time. So then you have the question about how then should the Christian behave politically? As much as the Christian would like to remain distant from political struggle, nonetheless, even here, the commandment of love urges the Christian to stand up for his neighbor. And this is from his academic work in 1931. How does that land on you?
So, to say how should we be Christian politically, we take the Republican or we take the Democrat side. And that's not the point of the whole situation. It's to be relevant in the day that you are there. We read the Bible as something that is inerrant word of God. And it is the fact that when these things were written, there was a whole different situation going on in that world. And it's written in such a way that it gives you kind of a generic idea of how to react to those situations.
Right.
So, use that word politically. I don't see that as being the correct word.
Well, and so what I hear you talking about is context, right? You're talking about you can't just take it as the word of God as static because things change, context change. Yes.
So I've got a better word. How about appropriately? How then should the Christian behave appropriately? Separating it from political party, political affiliation, whether you're a Nazi or not a Nazi, there are the situation demands that you act in a certain way appropriately.
All right. That's a good word. So Tom said, how do you act appropriately? Because you were bringing up politically in 2025 has a different, we immediately think parties, partisanship, right? Because that's what we've been taught. But to go back to the meaning of politic or politically, it is simply how the resources in a community are distributed among the community and how the community functions. That is what, and so I wonder if that's what he means by politically.
Well, it also leads into the fact that he says religionless Christianity. You know, I told you before, and I told Tom before, I've always thought that one of the things that is a real problem with being Christian is religion, because it can divide and separate Christians. So his idea of religionless Christianity plays into that idea. You know, it's basically I'm open to what's going on and what I can do, irrespective of what's going on with my other peers over here.
Right, right. Well, and that concept, how did some of the rest of you feel about that idea of religionless Christianity? Anybody picture chaos? You picture the opposite, okay? If it was less, okay.
Religious leaders over here, they're yelling this, and these religious leaders over here are yelling this, and they have these things, those things. Too much. Stop. Right? Jesus walked in the clothes he had on his body. That's what he did. It wasn't dressing for the day or dressing for the season. It was very simple. It's so simple.
Okay, so calm and peace because of simplicity, not having to worry about which symbol goes with what or which garments to wear.
Did I light the candle at the right time? Am I standing when I should stand? Should I kneel? Should I sit? Am I doing all the right things? Am I posturing correctly? Stop! That's not what God wants.
I can see that. So when I say I picture chaos, remember I had to learn all that. So my first response is, would I have a job? I mean, not really, but what if, how would they know how to do this and that? But then you get into, okay, maybe we don't have to wear the liturgical colors. But I don't think Bonhoeffer was completely against ritual, because in life together, in the seminary community, they were doing rituals. They were still saying the Mass. They were still praying together. They were still worshiping together. It just wasn't their chasubles and different kinds of cups and things like that. But the bare bones ritual still is, I think, important, right? I don't remember who I was telling this to, talking about funerals and talking about, celebration of life versus funerals. And that for some people, the prayers that we say in our ELW, that we say at funerals, and knowing that maybe it's the same prayer of commendation every single time, that is a way of being able to grieve. It gives you a way, and it gives you words when you don't have any. And so I think that he would agree with that kind of ritual, but that it is about the connection. It's about living together. It's about Christ being present. What? It's comfort. Right. And I thought the way you phrased it, Tom, was really interesting about, like, what do you do when you don't have all of the things, and all you have is your faith and a group of people? Yeah, Lori.
For me, the religionless That's, to me, that's religion. That's doing that. Now, religion asks less, we bring those barriers away. So it's focusing more on Christ and unity with Christ than all these barriers that we put up. And so to me, it's truly Catholic religion has less. I mean, that's the first thing. That doesn't take ritual, like, it doesn't take all that, but it takes all these barriers and these differences. And it was a hard question to answer. You know, because she said, I thought you were Christian. You know, so I mean, it complicates things so much. Religion. And trying to explain what's the true message and how, and religion, I think, creates distance, and it doesn't. So that's how I see it.
Okay. So freedom, because you're taking down the barriers of like the boxes that we put people in. Okay, yeah.
But different cultures worship in different ways because of the diversity of people. And so it is good to worship in other cultures, right? Because it takes those blindfolds off of your eyes. See, it's the message that's important. But you need to be comfortable in the way that you come to God and have that relationship. Because we each have a special relationship with God that's completely different from your neighbor.
Right. Right. We each, the way that we connect with God is different from our neighbor, but also, like you were saying, Deb, being exposed to the way that our neighbors worship, which is informed in different cultures by their cultural experience. And so, you know, we, for example, offering, like the collection of offering for the sake of the community is something that's pretty common amongst all denominations and all denominations in everywhere as Christians. But I'm going to guess that offering in Niger, like when your son was there, looks very different than passing the plate here. I mean, I've heard from colleagues of mine that have gone to Tanzania, because we have the ELCA is a sister synod with Tanzania, who have talked about chickens and livestock, because that's what the people had to bring forward. So, yeah.
You know, the thing about the ritual part too, sometimes it's very like when Bonhoeffer talks about community as well, some of the ritual that we do brings us together as a community.
Right.
So that's kind of important too.
Right. Some of the
Rituals, so that we all have activities and
right. Ritual does bring us together. Worship brings us together. Prayer brings us together. Communion absolutely brings us together.
Does this include theological things or morality things?
I'm going to defer to you.
So from his perspective, he's in prison, and Christians in prison are worshiping together, and it doesn't matter if they were Baptist or Catholic or Lutheran or whatever.
What about Jewish?
They were dead already. And so,
Yeah.
yes, so I think his ecumenical viewpoint did not include non-Christians, but his ecumenical viewpoint. And when he came to the United States, right after his doctoral dissertation, he worshipped at a Black Baptist church in New York. So that I think he was an ecumenical leader of his time in the 20s and 30s. There weren't very many people that were arguing for worshiping with Christians of other denominations than he was, because he didn't think that the rituals was what freed the church. The ritual is not the church. The ritual is one of the media that we use to communicate the message, but the
Right.
That was just us being
He
tough.
did preach tolerance and then respect of the other people.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So I don't think that he was ready to worship with Jews, but he definitely did not think that Jews should be discriminated against or killed.
Right, and he had a brother-in-law who was Jewish, I believe. But thank you, that I didn't know the answer to that. So more of an ecumenical, meaning inter-Christian group. And again, at this time, much more siloed, the different kinds. Well, it's 12:32, so I want to be mindful of time, but I'm so glad that all of you came, and I'm so glad, Tom, that was excellent. And next week we get to hear Eric. See, this is the great thing about having teachers and professors in our congregation. They know how to do it. So next week we'll get to hear Eric, and I hope that this was really enlightening for you and makes you think. So thank you.